Story number 1.
The room beyond the wall. It started with a sound, soft, almost imperceptible. At first, Emily thought it was the creaking of an old house, the kind of noise you get used to after living in a place for a while. But the longer she listened, the more she realized it wasn't just random noise, it was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone tapping their fingers against a hollow surface. It always came from the same spot, the far wall of her bedroom. Emily had bought the house a few months ago. It was a fixer-upper, but the price had been too good to pass up. The house was old, built in the early 1900s, and its history intrigued her. The previous owner, an elderly man named Mr. Grayson, had lived there for decades before passing away. The tapping started about a month after she moved in. It wasn't constant, just enough to catch her attention at odd hours of the night. She checked the wall for anything that might be causing it. Pipes, loose beams, maybe an animal trapped in the crawl space. But she found nothing. What unsettled her most was that it seemed to come from inside the wall. One night, as the tapping grew louder, she pressed her ear against the wall. "Is someone there?" she whispered, half expecting silence. Instead, the tapping stopped. Her heart raced. She backed away, staring at the wall as if it might answer. That's when she heard it. A faint voice, muffled and distorted like someone speaking through layers of wood and plaster. "Help me," it said. Emily didn't sleep that night. The next morning she called a contractor to inspect the wall. He knocked and tapped, listening for hollow spaces, but found nothing unusual. "It's probably just the house settling," he said, shrugging. But Emily wasn't convinced. The voice had been real. A week later, she decided to investigate herself. Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, she began prying away at the plaster. It felt ridiculous, like she was chasing a ghost, but she couldn't ignore the gnawing curiosity, or the growing sense of dread. As she chipped away at the wall, she uncovered something she didn't expect: a door. It was small, barely large enough for a child to crawl through, and made of dark, aged wood. The handle was rusted, and the edges were sealed with old nails and strips of cloth. Her breath hitched as she reached out to touch it. The moment her fingers brushed the surface, the tapping resumed, faster, more frantic. Against her better judgment, she pried the door open. Inside was a narrow, dark passage barely lit by the beam of her flashlight. The air was damp and smelled of decay. She hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to stop, but something compelled her to crawl inside. The passage led to a small room hidden between the walls. It was cramped and bare, with nothing but a tattered mattress and a rusted metal bucket in the corner. And then she saw it, writing scratched into the walls. "Let me out." The words covered every inch of the room, overlapping and etched so deeply into the wood that splinters littered the floor. Before she could process what she was seeing, the door behind her slammed shut. Emily spun around, her flashlight flickering. The room was pitch black now, the faint tapping replaced by something worse, breathing. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice shaking. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was hunched, its limbs unnaturally long, its face obscured by matted hair. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, locking onto hers. "You let me out," it rasped, its voice a grotesque echo of the one she'd heard through the wall. Emily scrambled for the door, her hands fumbling for the handle. The thing moved closer, its bony fingers reaching for her. With a desperate shove, she forced the door open and crawled back into her bedroom. She slammed the secret door shut and nailed it closed, her heart hammering in her chest. The tapping stopped after that, but Emily didn't feel safe. She moved out a week later, leaving the house and everything inside behind. She never told anyone what happened, not fully. But sometimes, late at night, she still hears it. The faint tapping, like someone trapped behind a wall begging to be let out.
Story number 2.
The silent passenger. It was supposed to be an ordinary night for Hannah. She worked the late shift at the hospital and was driving home on the empty stretch of highway that cut through miles of forest. The road was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears and made the hum of the car engine seem louder than it should be. She yawned, glancing at the clock on the dashboard. 2:37 a.m. The headlights carved through the darkness, illuminating the dense trees that lined the road. The air was cold and she could see her breath fogging up the windshield. She turned up the heater and flipped on the radio, hoping for some noise to keep her company. The static crackled, and a faint, distorted voice whispered through the speakers before the station cut out entirely. She frowned, glancing at the radio. "Old car problems," she muttered. But when she looked back at the road, she saw someone standing at the edge of her headlights, a figure in a pale dress barefoot with their back to her. Hannah slammed on the brakes, her tires screeching as the car skidded to a halt. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the figure. It was a woman. Her long hair hung in wet strands and her dress clung to her body as if she'd been caught in a downpour. Hannah rolled down her window just a crack, enough to call out, "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman didn't move. Hannah hesitated, every instinct telling her to drive away, but her conscience wouldn't let her. What if this woman was hurt or lost? She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, stepping out into the cold night air. The woman stood perfectly still, her head tilted downward. "Ma'am?" Hannah said, inching closer. As she reached out, the woman turned to face her. Hannah froze. The woman's face was wrong. Her features were blurred, almost like a smudged painting, and her eyes were too wide, too dark. Before Hannah could scream, the woman smiled, a slow, unnatural stretch of her lips. The next thing Hannah knew, she was sitting in her car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. She didn't remember getting back inside. The road ahead was empty again, as if the woman had never been there. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her daze. She looked at the screen. It was a text from an unknown number. "Thank you for stopping." Her stomach flipped. She glanced at the passenger seat, half expecting to see someone sitting there, but it was empty. Shaking, she started the car and sped down the highway, the shadows of the trees stretching ominously across the road. When she finally pulled into her driveway, her nerves were frayed. She locked the car doors, ran inside, and bolted her front door. She stood in the hallway, catching her breath, when she noticed something on her phone. The screen was lit up, showing her recent call history. She hadn't made any calls that night, but there it was, a single outgoing call to 2:37 a.m., the exact time she had seen the woman, the recipient, a number she didn't recognize. That night, Hannah couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events in her mind. Was it a hallucination? Stress from the long hours at work? As her eyes began to droop, she heard a faint noise. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window. She didn't want to look. Every part of her screamed to keep her eyes closed, to pretend she hadn't heard it. But the tapping grew louder, more insistent. Finally, she turned her head, her heart hammering in her chest. The woman was standing outside the window, her blurred face pressed against the glass, smiling. And this time she wasn't alone. Behind her, shadowy figures moved in the darkness, their eyes glowing faintly as they stared back at Hannah. Hannah's scream was swallowed by the night. When the neighbors checked on her the next morning, the house was empty. Her car was still in the driveway, her keys on the kitchen counter. But Hannah was gone. And every night since, drivers on that stretch of highway report seeing a woman in a pale dress standing by the roadside. Some stop to help. They never make it home.
Story number 3.
The Mirror Man. Lena always hated the antique mirror in her grandmother's house. It was massive, with an ornate gilded frame that looked like it belonged in a haunted mansion. It hung in the upstairs hallway, positioned so that you couldn't avoid catching your reflection as you passed by. When Lena inherited her grandmother's house after her passing, she thought about getting rid of it. But something stopped her. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was the faint, irrational fear that disturbing it might somehow unleash whatever bad energy it seemed to hold. So, the mirror stayed. It wasn't long before Lena started noticing strange things. At first it was subtle. She'd pass the mirror and feel an odd chill, like someone was breathing on the back of her neck. Sometimes she thought she saw movement in the glass that didn't match her own. Just a flicker of shadow, gone so quickly she convinced herself she was imagining it. But then things got worse. One night, while brushing her teeth, Lena glanced into the bathroom mirror and froze. In the reflection, she saw not just herself, but the hallway behind her, and the antique mirror at the end of it. Standing in front of it was a man. He was tall and gaunt, his face pale and blurred, like it had been smeared with wet paint. He wasn't in the hallway when she turned around, only in the reflection. Lena's breath caught. She squeezed her eyes shut, then opened them again. He was gone. After that, Lena avoided the upstairs hallway as much as she could. But the mirror seemed to demand her attention. It started small, scratches on the glass that hadn't been there before, faint handprints too large to be hers. Then at night, she began to hear noises. Soft tapping, like fingernails against glass. It always came from the direction of the mirror. One night, curiosity got the better of her. She tiptoed to the hallway and stood in front of the mirror, the tapping still echoing softly. Her reflection stared back, pale and trembling. But as she leaned closer, her reflection didn't move. It smiled. Terrified, Lena tried to cover the mirror with a sheet, but the tapping grew louder, more aggressive. That night, she dreamed of the man. In the dream, he stood on the other side of the mirror, his hands pressed against the glass, his mouth moving silently as if he was begging to be let out. When she woke, she found the sheet torn to shreds on the floor, the mirror's surface covered in scratches. Among the scratches were words carved deeply into the glass. "Help me." Desperate, Lena called a local antiques dealer to take the mirror away. He arrived the next day, an older man who seemed immediately uneasy the moment he saw it. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice low. "It was my grandmother's," Lena replied. The man shook his head. "This mirror, it's been around for centuries. Stories say it traps something inside. Something that shouldn't get out." "What kind of something?" Lena asked, her stomach sinking. The man didn't answer. Instead, he carefully wrapped the mirror in heavy cloth and loaded it into his truck. As he drove away, Lena felt a sense of relief she hadn't experienced in weeks. That night, for the first time in months, Lena slept peacefully. But when she woke, something was wrong. The tapping was back, louder than ever. It wasn't coming from the hallway this time. It was coming from the bedroom mirror. Lena's blood ran cold as she approached it. The surface of the glass rippled like water, and there he was, the man, his face pressed against the inside, his eyes wide and pleading. Before she could scream, the mirror cracked, and a single whisper escaped, "I'm free." Lena was never seen again. When her friends and family searched the house, they found all the mirrors shattered, shards scattered across every room. But no one could explain the old gilded mirror which sat intact in the center of the living room, its surface impossibly clean. If you stand in front of it for too long, they say, you might see a face that isn't your own staring back. And if you listen closely, you might hear a voice whisper, "Won't you let me out?"